I can't go on writing about cycling in cities from a 2011 perspective, so come with me into the future. We're going to get out of this era. We're going to start talking as though we've woken up in 2021 and all of this nonsense has passed. So here we are in 2021, and for the first time my country, Australia, has conducted a census that showed cycling to be a mainstream mode of transportation. 20% of trips in Melbourne and Brisbane are made using bikes. Sydney has 15%. My own middling-sized city of Newcastle topped the lot with 30%. That is because Newcastle was the first Australian city where planners looked at urban renewal sites and ways they could be linked up with bike paths as constituting a network that they called a CycleSpace Zone. CycleSpace zones are super high density. Most of the buildings are ramped or else ride-through. You know you're in one if you feel as though your shoelaces are tied together if you're not on a bicycle. And don't even try to take a car into a CycleSpace zone. If you're lucky enough to find a road in, you certainly won't find a parking space. Zoning laws prohibit any car parking at all in these places. With the benefit of hindsight, we can say the early 2000s was a kind of proto-CycleSpace period. There are 3 reasons to say that. A wave of development saw many urban renewal projects forge ahead, but with urban morphologies that were hardly as fine-grained and walkable as urban designers would like. During the growth period of the 1980s, the narrow streets, small lots, and high site coverage flowing from the thinking of Jane Jacobs, Gordon Cullen, Jan Gale, etc., were a barrier to the biggest developers. By the 2000s, pension funds had made large-scale developers the norm. Urban renewal authorities acquiesced with big lots and wide streets. The cities resulting had a scale that was alienating to pedestrians, but not so bad if you had a bike. The photos we've been looking at are of Ørsted, an urban renewal scheme in Copenhagen. And looking back, we can say places like these gave us another milestone of the proto-CycleSpace period. For decades, bikes had greatly extended the user catchment areas of metro stations in towns outside major cities, in countries like Denmark and Holland. But when your home station is just 15 minutes from town, and when modern bikes let moderately fit people ride with so little effort, why mess about with the mode change? That was the situation in Ørsted, just a 15-minute bike ride from the city. The other development of the proto-CycleSpace period was the building of recreational bike routes, not where people needed to cycle for transport, but where people could ride their bikes without inconveniencing voters with cars, which back then meant pretty much everyone. So recreational bike routes flanked waterways, crossed parks and made use of rail easements, often left abandoned by industry. We're looking at pictures from Minneapolis, a classic example. 10 years ago, in 2011, its bike share was just 2.5%, but in those days that was enough to make Minneapolis America's second big bicycling city after Portland, then with just 5%. For reference, New York's bike share a decade ago was half of 1%, incredible by today's standards. What Minneapolis had that got cycling started were rail trails, park connectors on former industrial land, like where once there were mills by the river, and old industrial bridges, one that the city bought for $1. From 1991 onwards, thanks to the passing of an act guaranteeing funding for bike works, routes like these that bypassed the roads were systematically fixed up for bike use. In a country brainwashed by John Forrester's 1970s doctrine of vehicular cycling that says bikes are best treated like cars, Minneapolis's recreational network, circuitous and lonely as it was then, at least gave cyclists a chance to use bikes for transport, even at night, in the rain, when cycling on the road is unconscionably dangerous. So what changed in the last decade that those recreational bike routes are now flooded with kids riding to school, people using bicycles to do shopping, cargo bikes making deliveries, and 1 billion people worldwide cycling to work? Put simply, planners, when they had tried to introduce protected bike paths in established areas, were stymied by voters wanting more space for cars. So, albeit with some reluctance, planners brought Main Street to where there were bikes. The brownfield tracks, waterfronts and undercapitalised parklands flanking the recreational bicycling routes were rezoned as CycleSpace zones to allow the construction of public institutions, shopping centres, workplaces and lots of high-density housing. While the new developments had no car parking and minimal investment in buses or trams, there was no expense spared in pandering to people on bikes. The enclosed, backdrafted bike routes we now take for granted were unimaginable just 10 years ago. A decade ago, when driving was viable, the expectation was that former industrial land should provide even more open green space than existed already. Selling existing urban parkland to developers, even if no one was using it, well, that was unthinkable. How quickly the mob discards lofty ideals to suit changing circumstance. Because the exurbs were struggling, peak oil and the late running on alternative energy generation meant both regular and electric cars were too expensive to run. Suburban house markets collapsed as the Great Reset, identified by Richard Florida in the wake of the 2008 GFC, looked more like a great exodus from the burbs to the city. Urban consolidation, once a fancy word used only by planners, appeared as graffiti on walls. Any green space in the city, if it was only being used as a toilet for dogs, was rezoned for high-density housing. It was a happy coincidence that many of the former industrial sites favoured by developers of affordable housing also flanked former industrial rail routes. No surprise really, given factories and rail originally belonged to the same networks. Quite by accident, suburbia's refugees, upon moving to town, found their newly built neighbourhoods were on the edge of recreational bicycling trails. The same was true of underutilised parkland being sold for development. New housing here tended to flank bike paths that ran beside waterways and across parks. Governments and developers realised what was happening at about the same time. A pattern of urbanisation had grown out of circumstance that inherently favoured bicycle transit. Governments from as early as the 2000s were ready to back bikes if they could, that is, if they could help bikes without hurting cars. Spending on cycling meant saving on healthcare, reducing emissions, and saving on roads and new trains. So they welcomed the chance to invest, not on bike lanes in old parts of town where car lovers took umbrage, but on recreational routes now being used for bicycle transit. It would not be long before every waterway, canal, and old rail easement had covered bike lanes and flyover bridges where they intersected with roads. As for developers, they could see cyclists were a ripe demographic. The ones fleeing car land each had an extra $10,000 at their disposal per annum that many were choosing to spend on their housing. But a surprisingly high proportion of bike nuts were wealthy, middle-class fitness buffs, educated left or green voters, and retirees aging actively. A wealthy, healthy, but hitherto odd demographic suddenly were worth going after. Among developers there was competition to build the most bike-friendly buildings. They looked to a building in Copenhagen called 8 House that had been built in 2011. In Ørsted, the place I said earlier was a prototype CycleSpace Zone, 8 House pampered bicycling residents with access balconies spiralling all the way to the top like switchback roads ascending a mountain. They could ride home from work to their apartments without putting a foot on the ground. Developers looked to 8 House the way public housing authorities in the 50s and 60s looked to Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation in Marseille. Only 8 House, part perimeter block and part Fifth Avenue Guggenheim, had overcome Le Corbusier's oversights. Its access balconies really were like streets in the sky, contiguous with each other and the real street down on the ground. They made Le Corbusier's elevated streets look as the streets of Manhattan would look if the avenues were taken away. And moving from street to street had to be done via the vortex of the subway. Architects conceived buildings with no vertical subways, by that I mean lifts, only ramps. They looked to Carlo Raddi's London Cloud, an unbuilt proposal/fantasy from 2010, to build towers that people would ride up on bikes. They looked at Cube House in Rotterdam, one of the earliest ride-through buildings. What if schools and shops were ride-through? The many ride-through buildings appearing in architectural journals now in the 2020s are products of that theoretical discourse. As well as discussions around bike-friendly typology and circulation, attention turned to the first wave of buildings that propagandized for cycling. The Washington Bike Station, that looked more like an avant-garde museum than a place to park bikes, and the Danish Pavilion at the 2010 World Expo in China, a ride-through spiralling building dispensing free-to-use bikes. Architects' rhetoric was redolent with bike illusions. Anything that could be said about a bicycle's frugality, irreducibility, or means of production, architects found they could say about buildings. The bicycle was a paragon, as machines had been in the 20s, or the body had been in the Renaissance. Relocating suburbia's victims into high-density housing, with little or no public transport, had been decried as a recipe for alienation, suicide and high levels of crime, but the opposite turned out to be true. Because of their speed, cyclists were a ubiquitous presence, always putting eyes on the street. But unlike drivers who appear on the scene but drive past, cyclists were insinuated in events going on all around them. They provided the passive surveillance pedestrians do, yet to a whole district, not just the busiest streets. This lessened the strictures on urban planning. Districts could have their own distinct urban morphologies. Even towers in the park could be built without giving rise to the kind of chaos that led to Pruitt-Igoe being demolished. Most cities now have two distinct zones, intertwining like a yin and a yang. Everywhere we see a new cycling city interweaving with, but largely separated from, the networks of streets that for almost a century have been dominated by cars. And while there was rivalry and talk of separate governments, the sense we have now is that the new cities are acting as beacons. Just as the car-free hippie town of Christiania in Copenhagen could be said to have inspired the demonstrations throughout the rest of the city in support of bike lanes in the mid-1970s, the presence of CycleSpace zones is inspiring change in their host cities. Conditions are ripe now in 2021 for the bikeification of Main Street.